I'll introduce our list of speakers and really want to have an engaging dialogue with you over the next short little while. I also like to recognize the Global Institute for Food Security and thank them for being our webinar platform host today. And Tina Murdoch and her team have been just really helpful in enabling us to bring this to fruition. So with that, I'd like to just quickly jump into a little bit of a short presentation for you, again, to sort of explain what we're all about, what this webinar hopes to accomplish. And then I will introduce our first panel for you. I would say that I'm not going to be getting into detailed bio descriptions of speakers. You have seen the bio package that's been sent to you in your email, so please refer to that material. I'll also encourage you to use the chat function if you have a question or a comment. I will do my best, and Deb Wilson, who will join us for panel 2, we will do our best collectively to try to represent some of your questions or comments to our 2 panels. We are recording this event, as you know, and we will publish this next week. We hope with some or if not all of the presentations you'll see, so that if we miss something, it serves as a reference for us. So no comment or question will go unread by us and our partners, even though we might not be able to get to absolutely everything today. With that, I'm going to just jump into giving you a framing overview, if you like, of what we're here to accomplish. And I'll come back to our first panel. So let me see if I can do this right. We've practiced many times. You'd think by now we would all have this streamlined, but here we go. And I hope everyone can see this cover page. So I'd like to introduce our initiative and really give you a sense of what we're trying to accomplish. And in short, if I were to summarize this, there's a lot going on globally in terms of the agri-food sector. In terms of how we measure success and performance, there's a whole shift to embracing outcomes-based targets and indices. They're proliferating here in Canada, around the world. And this is serving to benchmark food production's impact on the environment, on a whole series of social indicators and health performance, among other initiatives. And really what is happening is that the marketplace is driving change, as are a series of global commitments amongst governments and at a global level. So there's a lot going on in terms of how we need to measure or respond to a changing world around us. So what's missing? And why are we here today? Well, in part, what we'd like to do is we need to show, or we'd like to show, how Canada could be among one of the leading environmental, sustainable, safe, and reliable food suppliers. The challenge is that we really don't have a set of high-level indicators, although there is a lot of data and metrics out there that reveal how we are performing on these particular factors. Moreover, we need to get better aligned as a country, and I think this is probably fair for most food systems around the world, getting aligned across food systems here and between those government and non-government players and academia who enable the sector to succeed. And part of our work involves how we can actually broaden this effort. And this webinar today is part of that process. So what is our project, the National Index on Agri-Food Performance, all about? Well, clearly we need to demonstrate our leadership and where we're making progress or where we're short or have gaps on those key indicators. The second thing that we need to do, and this is part of a process that will unfold over the next number of months, is how can we actually use this? It's not a data chase, but how can we use this information to inform policy choices, how we can improve competitiveness, how we support innovation. And we're doing all of this work not by solving all of these complex questions, but by framing this up by early 2021. So today's agenda is really to enable this conversation and reach out to more people as part of it. So the first panel, which I'll get to in a minute, is about taking a look at global views of benchmarking. And the second panel is a little more focused on domestic developments, what we are doing here already or can do to enable alignment and develop domestic dashboards. This is a key question I'd like our speakers to keep in mind, particularly, and for you as we talk through these issues. But how can Canada's agri-food sector design appropriate benchmarks to demonstrate its leadership and progress? So I mentioned a process, and today, of course, we're having this webinar, but this is really part of a whole series of discussions and research and outreach that will lead to a final report at the end of January of 2021. I'd like to thank our partners. We have 21 partners who are fully committed and engaging and provide super advice as we proceed, and they are making this all possible. And that brings us to our panel. Start right away and just jump right into this by introducing Victoria de Bourbon de Parme with the World Benchmarking Alliance. She is the Food Transformation Lead. And I will then introduce each speaker as we go. And so, Victoria, that's your cue to follow up. And I'm just going to jump out of this presentation. And now you can now jump in on yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David, for this introduction. And as David mentioned, I'll go straight to my PowerPoint that prepared for today's session. So I'm working at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we're currently developing the Food and Agriculture Benchmark. And today I'll tell you a bit more about the journey we have made, and in the Canadian context, how that could we could influence both each other and take some learnings. Just a step back, why are we benchmarking? Why are we out there? Well, the UN Sustainable Development Goals have been created together with businesses, because businesses are a key driver of those SDGs. And in our benchmarks in all different industries, we try to measure companies' performance on the SDGs. When I speak of the World Benchmarking Alliance, we are a non-profit organization and are mostly publicly funded. So all our data and our indexes and benchmarks that we produce are free and publicly available. And the stakeholders that use our data and our findings are the companies themselves, who are in scope of the benchmarks, but also investors, governments, civil society, and individuals. And really, what we always try to encourage with our benchmarks is recognize leadership, as together with creating accountability. So as the World Benchmarking Alliance, we've translated the SDGs into 7 systemic transformations that we feel need to really redefine the playing field to transition into this new world where we can achieve the SDGs. So we, of course, today are specifically focusing our food and agriculture on food and agricultural transformation, and that's what the team that I'm currently leading. But within the WBA, we also have corporate human rights benchmark and decarbonization benchmarks and a few others. So when developing methodologies, we, of course, look at what's already out there, which corporate reporting frameworks are out there. We look at the best available science. It's truly a multi-stakeholder collective coming together to develop the best methodology available and not replicate or duplicate, but really aggregate all of the findings and ideas that have already fostered, and translate that by really creating corporate action that translates also the public's and principles and normative standards that are out there. So really providing a roadmap for companies how to step up the game and make sure we create a better world in the next decade of action. If we zoom in for the food and agricultural space, we've translated all the food and agricultural agendas, global agendas that are out there for the food and agriculture benchmark. And on your right, you see the 3 dimensions that also David has actually alluded to, that I guess nowadays there's a global consensus that within a food systems transformation, we need to think about nutrition, we need to think about environment, and we need to think about the social factors that are so crucial along the whole value chain of the system. This is an overview of how we've really dived deeper into identifying topics that will be relevant within the benchmark that we are developing. So currently, this framework we have launched during the high-level political forum in July this year, and we are in the phase of translating all of these topics into concrete indicators upon which we will gather data and then publish the first food and agriculture benchmark next year at the UN Food Systems Summit. So for each of these topics, which also for a Canadian context is interesting to look at, how relevant is it on a national level, or which topics are more important to zoom in from the perspective of Canada. So this I guess provides a good overview, and we can come back to that if that's desired. For the food and agriculture benchmark, we have in scope 350 keystone companies. We've identified these keystone companies as the ones playing a crucial role in transforming our food system. So there's no buy-in, buy-out, or opt-in or opt-out. It's really has been a consultative development of identifying these companies. And below I've listed the 8 companies that have their headquarters in Canada, which I thought would be a relevant, interesting context. But I also want to note that the project partners, Bayer and Syngenta, are of course also part of our keystone companies list. And as you see, for the benchmark that we are currently developing, we've really chosen for a really broad scope, so encompassing the entire value chain, from inputs to specifically animal protein, to traders, then to the manufacturing companies, all the way to consumer influencing retailers, but even restaurants and food services, as we believe that each of these different sectors are crucial into transforming the food systems. So if you would put that in a graph, you could maybe look at it from this way, that the food and agriculture benchmark that we are producing at the World Benchmarking Alliance looks really at a really broad overview. So we don't go incredibly deep on specific topics. You've got very interesting, good spotlight indexes doing that, like the Access to Nutrition Index, but also in-house at the World Benchmarking Alliance, we have the Access to Seeds Index, or Seafood Stewardship Index, and the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. And those are really interesting if you want to zoom in at a specific topic. But it has been over and over again with investors and with policymakers. It came about that there's really need for a more broader overview, and that is the gap we will try to fill with the food and agriculture benchmark. And of course, I've placed the flag of Canada in the middle because we're talking about the national index, and from a food and agriculture benchmark global perspective, the Canadian index would be very much a spotlight from really zooming in on a national context. And you see this in different areas popping up as well, to really zoom in on specific regions or specific topic or a country like Canada. And for today, I hope we can take away that we here at the WBA are very much there to share our lessons learned. We've gone through a long development and feasibility study and scoping reports and research for about 3 years. So there's lots of insights on developing the scope and developing the framework and also translating indicators. But one of the most important messages, I'd say, for such a national Canadian index is really to answer the question, what impact would you like to realize with such a national index? And so what type of outcomes are you seeking in such an index? And so really drive it back from the results to then what would you need to design, and which partners are really key in establishing something like that. And a second key lesson from today's session can also be that how is national relevant metrics fitting in with the global agenda? We have these global discussions on UN level and in other multilateral platforms. And how does that feed into the national discussion? And I think, especially with the UN food systems coming up, there's a struggle of really translating the global agendas to national relevant policy and actions by corporates. So this summit can also really bring all these forces and all this knowledge together, because at the end of the day, we're developing all these global agendas and interesting ideas, but action really happens on a national level. So identifying really game-changing initiatives and things that work really well on a specific national level, and that can be possibly scaled up and translated into really a system changing force, could be a very interesting lesson that the global players and the global society can learn from a national perspective. And then the third one, I mentioned already, collaboration. I mean, we're collaboration between a national Canadian index and, for example, the food and agriculture benchmark. And I think with it on the first hand, you may maybe think about really going together on the road of indicator development and making sure there's an alignment of methodology, and that there's systems in place for data sharing, so that companies who, for example, are in scope of multiple indexes are not overburdened by all the requests that are coming out there. But I'd like to see such a collaboration, if you will, even further. I think it's at the end the result, we're not set up to really just produce benchmarks, right? Our ultimate goal is to really impact the way systems work and the way our society is shaped, and that only happens when really collectively we come together from each of our angles, whether it's government, whether it's civil society, whether it's from the private sector, and everybody has its role to play. And indexes and benchmarks provide a data-driven way of change, and so on a Canadian level, with the World Benchmarking Alliance, I think you can really have a collective engagement force, and we are already collaborating with other national spotlights and index initiatives, and would be, of course, very open to collaborate further with such a Canadian initiative. And I think both ways we can learn lots from each other. So very interested to follow how this will go on, and I'm open for questions. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and I was delighted to see you put Canada at the pivot point in your bar chart. All the initiatives around the world. There you are. Okay, so that will make us all feel very good. What I'd like to do, Victoria, with your permission, would be actually to bring Chris into the conversation, because this is Chris is part of an initiative that has actually done an index, and then pause after Chris's comment and have a little bit of a discussion with both of you, because you both are sort of coming at this from a very similar approach. So, Chris, I'm just going to quickly introduce you, and Victoria, pay attention because we'll come back to you. I'd like to introduce Christophe Benet, Senior Researcher, the Alliance of Biodiversity International, the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. People will be interested as to why we've invited you, for example, to a Canadian discussion, but also being part of the consultative group on international agricultural research, the esteemed CGIAR. So, Chris, over to you. And I should say, for those who are watching, Chris is tuning in from Colombia. And so in case there's a disconnect for him from a telecommunications, he will go off screen and make his presentation. Okay, Chris, over to you.
Thanks, David. Yes, good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for inviting me and allowing me to contribute to that quite exciting initiative. So yes, as David said, I'm going to just turn off my camera to ensure that the presentation runs smoothly, but I'll see you on the other side after that in about 10 minutes from now. So let me just share my screen. And we can start. Okay, very good. So, so the background of this presentation is really a paper that was published a couple of months ago in the international journal Scientific Data, which is part of the Nature publishers. The paper presented a global map of food system sustainability and the associated indicators too. The paper received a fair amount of attention from all over the world. And what I want to do today is actually to share some, review some of the lessons that emerge from that initiative, hoping that you'll find some of those useful for your own project. So let's start first by why we started that initiative. So the first reasons is very much the recognition of that increasing interest and probably growing need to be able to measure food system and food system sustainability. In other terms, is about making, building on the famous Peter Drucker quote, which is you can't really manage what you can't measure. The second reason why we engaged in that initiative was the recognition that whatever you try to measure, your measure is only as good as it is accurate. In other terms, if what you propose on an index is actually biased in one or another, you may or are likely to make more harm than actually not measuring anything at all. And in that sense, it's actually true, as David mentioned, there's a flurry number of initiatives that claim that they're actually measuring the sustainability of food system. But a large number of those initiatives are actually suffering several methodological issues, which I'm hoping will help you improving your own initiative. The first is the fact that a lot of those existing initiatives have the tendency to focus on the OECD countries, the high-income countries, for very simple reasons, is because those countries are the ones where there's more data. Our ambition was to have actually a global picture of the food system sustainability. So in that sense, we really put emphasis on including low and middle income countries in that global index. The second difficulty that you may observe with some of those initiatives is the fact that they often focus on only some of the dimension of sustainability. And in particular, there's a strong emphasis on two dimensions, the nutrition and the environment. We came from with the ambition that we wanted a more holistic understanding and interpretation of sustainability. So that means that in particular, in addition to the nutrition and food security, and in addition to the environmental dimension, we pay attention to include the economic and the social dimension into the index. So you can see here, so the map again, the resulting map is a map which actually covers 97 countries, both from higher income and from low and middle income countries, some from both developed and developing countries, if you want. It includes or is made up or build 20 indicators which are organized in 4 dimensions of sustainability: food security and nutrition, environment, economic, and social. Now, where does Canada fit or sit into this? So you can see that actually Canada is doing pretty well in that index. Is actually ranked 3rd after New Zealand and Switzerland. You can see the aggregate score on the first column on the left-hand side next to the country name. And then you have the 4 columns, which are the disaggregated score for each of the dimensions of that index. Now, there's somebody who just unmuted itself, give some feedback. Now, in anticipation of maybe some of the questions that are likely to be asked, I wanted to show which indicators have been actually included in each of the 4 dimensions. And in particular, I understand that there were several people that were slightly surprised to see that Canada was doing so well, in particular in relation to the environmental dimension of the food system. So you can see here that in that environmental dimension, there were 6 indicators that were included. One was the greenhouse gas emitted by Canada or by the agriculture sector sorry, not of Canada, for each country. The second was the quantity of groundwater that was used by the agriculture sectors as a percentage of the total renewable water. The quality of the soil of each country as a percentage, as a soil content. The percentage or the proportion of the land that was used by the agriculture. And then we had two biodiversity index, one on the wildlife, if you want, that's the biodiversity index. And we had the crop diversity index, which was capturing the diversity of crops. So those were the 6 dimensions that were included in the environmental. You can see the other indicators for the economic, social, and nutrition and food security. So some reflection from the process, which again, I'm hoping will help guiding or trigger some discussion amongst you in your attempt to build your own benchmark for Canada. The first is what I call the tyranny of the available data set. The idea that actually a lot of the initiatives that you see out there, in those initiatives, there's a tendency to include indicators for which we know we have data. So that means that actually you will observe a bias toward a particular subsector of the food system, in especially the production in the agriculture subsector and the consumption. Those are the 2 sub-elements of your food system from which or for which we all usually have a lot of data, and then that means a bias toward those subsectors in the way people build their aggregate index. The second lesson is that a lot of those existing index are usually framed around only 2 disciplines, environment and nutrition. And a very good example of that is the Eat Lancet report, which was published last year. And those of you who are familiar with that report will have noticed that what the Eat Lancet report does, it basically shows that it is possible to reconcile the healthy diet, so the nutrition, with the planetary boundary. So basically the cost or the footprint impact of the food system. But there was very little on the economic and the social dimension of food system in the report. There's 2 kind of dual explanation for that. A bit of epistemology, which is the fact that a lot of the experts which have engaged so far in those questions about food system are mainly coming from 2 communities of practice. The health, public health and nutrition on one hand, which is why you have so many emphasis on the nutrition aspect. And the other is the people who have worked on the agroecology, environmental issues, looking at, again, the footprint of food system. And at the end of the day, you have a partial image of that sustainability because a lot of emphasis are only on those 2 dimensions. The third lesson is the recognition that there's a trade-off between the need to build an index that is specific enough to capture the specificity of the countries of interest. So for you would be Canada, yet at the same time being generic enough to allow to compare to other countries. That issue of comparability is very important. In your case, if I had only presented you the score of Canada without the score of the other countries, it would not have been very useful. It become informative because you are actually able to compare the score of Canada with other countries. So there would be a tension, if you want, between trying to build a benchmarking system that is very specific to your country, so reflecting the specificity of Canada, yet with indicators that you know also exist in other countries so that you can actually compare your benchmarking in Canada with other countries. Otherwise, you will be actually walking in the dark. The fourth and last lessons, if you want, is a bit of that polemic. I would call it a bit of what would be called a bit of a teasing sentence, which is this index doesn't tell me the story I want, therefore I will pick another one. That is just basically recognizing the cherry picking process that you may risk to adopt. The fact that people will go for particular index or indicators because they know that those indicators show what they want to show. And I think it's very important for you to have as a first critical steps in developing your benchmarking system to set up a pretty rigorous and transparent protocol even before you start collecting your data, so that you have a very clear inclusion and exclusion criteria that allow you to justify why particular indicators have been included and why others have been excluded. Otherwise, you run the risk of being accused to actually have picked up particular indicators because they fit your agenda. Along with that is the attention that needs to be paid to ensure that when we talk about food system and when we talk about the sustainability of food system, we really embrace that holistic interpretation of those two concepts and not a minimalist one, which will basically reflect who we are or where we come from and what discipline we are comfortable with. Sustainability is an holistic concept, and you benchmarking, if you claim to be reflecting that, will effectively have to have enough dimension to reflect all those different dimensions you want. This is it for me. I'm gonna.
Yes. Well, thank you, Chris. Very, very helpful. Chris and Victoria, I was struck by your two presentations. And Chris, just to play back a phrase you used, and I want to link it to something Victoria said. People were surprised to see how well Canada performed. We came tied at third in the environmental ranking. And then, Victoria, you mentioned that Canada has an opportunity to essentially be a test case, a national test case for the benchmarks that you're coming up with, or at least to help apply those. So what's key here is relevance and credibility. Can we come up with our own relevant set of benchmarks, even if they're validated, science-driven, done through a process of engagement with diverse players? Will we be believed at the end of the day? Will we have a credible, can we have a credible set of benchmarks and metrics, given, Chris, what you said? Victoria or Chris, would you like to pick up on that?
Chris, would you?
Victoria, please.
Yes, I think it's a good point to raise, because it all has to do with which parties you include and how collective you are in the development process, and so then it is important who is going to measure and how independent is such an analysis. So that's all part of the design process that has to be taken into account.
Yeah, I can only agree with what is being said here. Again, I think I would like just to help you preempting some of the trap within which you may fall if you don't think carefully, and especially in terms of being transparent in those different indicators you want to include in it. Everybody has a strong agenda to see, obviously, Canada doing very well. But at the end of the day, it may backfire you if it turns out that you have biased your process to actually reach a particular agenda. And I think it will be far healthier for the discussion and the debate, and potentially to identify area of intervention if we were also able to actually show that, well, some parts of the food system are not doing as well as others.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to come back to this discussion in the second panel for sure, and it's something of interest to us. So thank you for your presentations. I'm now going to move to Bridget Schrempf, who's the Manager of Sustainable Food Systems for CDP. And perhaps what we could do is, Bridget, we'll see what our time is, and then either have some questions or discussion, and then we'll move to Greg. So over to you, Bridget, if that's all right.
Thanks very much, David. I'm just going to share my screen here. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to be giving a bit of an overview, as David said, about CDP, which to preempt the question in terms of what does CDP stand for, it used to stand for Carbon Disclosure Project. However, we transitioned to using just the acronym as our programs expanded beyond carbon into other areas of environmental impact. And CDP really sits on, coming from Chris's presentation, we really sit in the E of ESG. So it is very much environmental impact disclosure. So we're going to be talking about how and what organizations that disclose to us, what they disclose in terms of their environmental data and why. So CDP, just a quick overview, we are a global environmental nonprofit, and we're working to secure a thriving economy that works for people and the planet in the long term. And we do this by emphasizing really the business case for transition to a low carbon economy. We do this in a few ways, but primarily we do so through running a global disclosure system that enables companies, cities, states, and regions to disclose what their impacts on the environment and natural resources are, and importantly, take action to reduce those negative impacts by working with market forces in order to motivate them to do so. The disclosure itself has grown a lot since the first request went out in 2003, when just over 200 companies around the world responded to, at that time, the climate change questionnaire, to now over 8,400 of the largest companies around the world responding across our 3 programs, which are climate change, water security, and our forests program. We really feel that information is the fundamental basis for action, as well as these benchmarking assessments, and we aim to make that environmental reporting mainstream and to provide detailed insights that will drive a climate safe, water secure, and deforestation-free world. Why has there been such growth in disclosure from companies? We really kind of see that connected to escalating concern coming from investors with environmental issues really becoming increasingly important to how they invest. And for this portion of the presentation, I'm going to be focusing on our corporate disclosure, although we do cities, states, and regions disclosure. But we are seeing that it's increasingly important to know how they're investing for both investors, but also purchasers as well as consumers want to be able to differentiate between companies and brands with respect to how they're actually managing their impacts, and contributing to the necessary solutions that we need to combat climate change and environmental degradation. So the request that goes out to companies, which includes suppliers every year to disclose, comes from are institutional investors as well as large purchasing companies. So we then, once they respond, we receive that information and consolidate the data in order to provide it back to them in decision useful formats. So just as investors are using the collected data in order to do risk assessment on their portfolios, big purchasing companies, customers, are also using their data to be able to evaluate their impact outside of their direct operations and into their supply chain. There's an amplifying effect in that not only does this data go back to those investors and purchasing authorities, but there is, when one public response goes into CDP, it goes into the hands of many across financial markets as well as civil society, with most ESG research and rating providers licensing data from CDP. How does this data, because we're talking about benchmarking today, how does this data relate to benchmarking? CDP is in itself benchmarking companies against their peers, which I'll explain momentarily, but importantly, the data that we collect, CDP collects either on its own or in combination with other information, also informs many other global benchmarks and assessments. One example being the ACT initiative, which is an initiative CDP is partnered on, which is assessing the low carbon transition. And this initiative is actually currently developing a methodology to assess agriculture and agri-food companies companies. But for our own form of benchmarking, we do this with a scoring methodology, which I've represented on the screen here, where once that data is provided to us, we assess the response and apply a score. So this is a means to assess what the responders' progress is towards environmental stewardship. And we assess the level of detail and comprehension. We kind of go through this stepwise function of assessing the level of detail and comprehension in the response, as well as what the company's awareness of these environmental issues are, and then what its management methods are, and its progress towards leadership. So whether it is taking the most ambitious actions and demonstrating best practice. In terms of what metrics we are including and how are they assessed, our scoring is very mission driven and focuses on the core principles and values of CDP for a sustainable economy, primarily highlighting the business case for transitioning to the low carbon economy and what actions this entails. So it very importantly, and what we hear often from companies, is that it provides them with this roadmap in order to achieve best practices. And then with us being able to continually develop this scoring methodology over time, we're able to drive changes in company behavior and improve that environmental performance. And as I said, this is the key element of disclosure and oftentimes what companies derive most value from, in that it's helping them shift environmental action to the heart of their business and have an ability through this globally standardized framework to learn through disclosure how to kind of direct their actions in that direction. So while CDP itself is not I would say it's not an assessment directly against global goals like the SDGs, although we do align our questionnaires with such global goals. It provides a mechanism to benchmark companies, in this case, companies against their peers, and does incentivize actions that are directly aligned and connected with global goals and recommendations. So just as an example of that, I've got 3 examples in the slide. I'll go through 2 of them. An example being the recommendations that came out of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. We have taken our climate questionnaire and it is now designed to turn those recommendations into accessible and actionable metrics, and then provide guidance and rationale behind those questions to companies, which enables them to articulate the TCFD recommendations and provide information that's consistent and relevant about these metrics, which is increasingly becoming an expectation around the globe for companies. Another and very important one, particularly for this conversation, is the adoption of science-based emissions reduction targets and incorporating the Science-Based Targets Initiative approved targets to ensure that each company is setting a target aligned with the level of reduction in greenhouse gases necessary to meet the global goals of the Paris Agreement. So you can see this kind of trajectory that a company follows from what we call disclosure to leadership, and how they're improving their action and therefore getting scored accordingly for moving along that pathway. I'm just going to skip the next one to kind of take it back to the scoring methodology, which is, in a sense, our benchmarking mechanism. I want to add that for each of the programs, it's designed to incentivize actions that are applicable to all companies in all sectors in all geographies. We do have sector-specific methodologies alongside these general questions that incentivize actions that are applicable only to companies operating within that sector, but across all geographies. So it truly is a global framework that is supposed to be incentivizing action that's applicable globally, and we're assessing that action globally. So in terms of the conversation today and kind of how it relates to my own particular area of work at CDP, which is a new area of work, trying to kind of bring all of our work together to incentivize transition and drive transition towards a more sustainable food system in all of the ways that we work with our stakeholders, including companies, including cities, states, and regions. Just kind of wanted to take some takeaways and kind of comments of considerations that I'm still having and maybe don't have the answers to yet in terms of what I'm working on. But some things I would mention is that, as I think it's already mentioned a few times in the webinar, that the metrics that we select should, where possible, be grounded in science. these global goals and target setting methodologies that I've mentioned that do exist or are under development. An example here being the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative for carbon emissions, but also the Science Based Targets Network, which is now developing methodologies for other planetary boundaries at the global level. However, some of those planetary boundaries do have local contexts that are needing to be considered in those target setting. But these are the global standard that are very much accepted and should be reflected in a national index as much as is possible and is relevant. But I do know, and something that I've been kind of coming across with my work, which is particularly trying to figure out, what are the interventions and what does the transition look like that we should be working specifically with our stakeholders to incentivize, is that agriculture is definitely somewhat more nuanced in terms of the solution doesn't look the same in different regions, and we need to figure out what we're going to incentivize and drive accordingly through our methods. So I would just note, and I've noted here on the slide, that there are some pertinent methodology developments that are underway, like I said, for the SBTI, as well as the ACT methodology. And it's also something that I'm considering for my project to determine what to incentivize in different regions. And this is a challenge that I haven't necessarily figured out yet, and I think are going to be somewhat dependent on what those methodologies produce and what level of regional specificity they're able to incorporate. To date, science-based targets, for example, is global. It doesn't have regional specificity in terms of emissions reduction targets, but that potentially could be a different case when it looks at something like the agriculture sector that can be very locally relevant. But just another point that I wanted to kind of make we're a data organization. We have a large pile of voluntarily reported data from companies, but it's that there is a need to avoid undue data burden. The bar is continually being raised in terms of what data people want and the desire for this data to then feed into analysis of how a particular group of companies or a particular country in this case or sector is performing against global goals like the Paris Agreement or the SDG. And we ourselves are kind of considering how we can provide that perspective on how the global food system and value chain is doing with respect to that transition, recognizing that data underpins this all. And we're trying to reduce this. We're trying to be able to reduce this reporting burden while it's still ensuring robust and transparent disclosures of sustainability performance. There was a recent announcement specifically where CDP was coming together with 5 framework and standard setting institutions on a shared vision of the elements necessary for more comprehensive corporate reporting and a joint statement and intent to drive towards those goals, working together to hopefully be able to reduce the level of data burden so that it can actually effectively inform these frameworks and indices. So that's where I will leave it. Obviously, some open questions that I haven't figured out yet and maybe not have all the advice, but I hope that was somewhat useful.
Well, Bridget, thank you very much. I have some questions on the side, but I'd like to pose a question to you, and perhaps Chris, as well as Victoria, might want to weigh in. But you've all shared certain numbers of principles for how to develop an effective, credible, relevant, science-based metrics or benchmark index. What's the most important principle that you think that should guide the development of an index? Bridget, I'm going to pass that to you first because you're on deck here. But what's the most important principle?
I mean, I do think I'm probably the least educated of the two to answer this question because I'm not the ones developing our scoring methodology. But from my experience in my area of work and CDP especially, as I said, we're not the group kind of determining what the metrics are to fully assess, how someone is doing against what the world needs. We've always tried to base it in data, base it in science, and we've definitely seen kind of the Science-Based Targets Initiative become a large part of our work, as well as my previous work. So I would say, make sure that as I said, kind of start at that global level of what science is saying is necessary at the global level and figure out kind of, I don't know if it's been done yet, but a reputable way to say this is Canada's share, and then therefore what does that mean in terms of implementation? And I know there's various scenarios, if we're even just talking about emissions, about what that means and choosing that direction. But I would say that, we always look in our work to be able to kind of back up where we're coming from, and backing that up with science is, I would say, the most important thing for me. But again, I think
Okay.
that the other two probably have some better answers there.
Well, that sounds pretty good to me. Chris, very briefly, what's the one thing that's on your mind?
Well, actually, I'm going to be diplomatic here. I don't think there's one thing, David. I think there's a couple of very important priorities, but I will not be able to boil it down to one single. I think some of the lessons that you have seen from the full presentation are key here, and I think it will be good for you and the group to visit some of them. The weight of having too many data is actually becoming a major issue at the present time, and we are working right now in trying to cut into that jungle of data, because it's not useful for the policymakers to be overflooded with too many dimensions. It doesn't help them to prioritize. But that's only one aspect of it. So
it's okay. We only have time for one. All right, Victoria, what's your one?
My one would be transparency. I'd say that alignment is crucial between all these different initiatives, but at the end of the day, I'd like to see companies already be transparent about all of these data. And that is what we're all driving, I guess.
I know it's an unfair question to force three deep thinking people to box it into one, but that's very interesting to get those perspectives. So thank you. I'm going to jump now to Greg Peterson, who's Assistant Chief Statistician, Economic Statistics for Statistics Canada. And you'll see why he is included in the global group. So Greg, are you ready to go? And he's coming in for a landing, everybody. Here we go. The screen is taking some time. So, Greg, we can't seem to see your screen.
Okay, I'm going to give this one last shot.
Okay.
Okay, well, I have a colleague who has a copy of my presentation, and if Augustine, if you could be so kind as to put the presentation onto the screen.
All right. So,
okay.
Greg, are you ready to go, or should we proceed with another question?
No, let's. I'll talk.
Okay.
Augustine, I'm hoping, can put the presentation on the screen, and the presentation will catch up to what it is that I'm saying.
Perfect.
And if I have to turn on the video and move to interpretive dance, I'll do so.
Perfect. All right.
So it's a pleasure to be here today. Any opportunity to talk about data is kind of a good day for somebody from Statistics Canada. Just by way of background, I am from Statistics Canada. I'm responsible for the economic and environment statistics programs over here. And as an agency, we have a broad range or broad mandate to measure, broad range of socioeconomic issues, policies, and programs, including a robust agriculture and environmental statistics program. When we do this, I mean, it means a few things. First, it means we've got, as an organization, we collected a lot of data. We're sitting on petabytes of information, about 5 petabytes of information last time we measured. And but to make all of that happen, we do a fair bit of work in developing standards and tools and means of integrating data from various sources together to inform Canadians on what's happening. So we do this, bring things together. We're often known for broad indicators like gross domestic product or unemployment rate or inflation. And these are indexes, and there are single numbers that describe things. But really, in all of these indexes, they're simply, collections or aggregations of things that, describe a particular phenomena. But where you get all of the information, where you get a lot of oomph, is diving in kind of beneath the aggregate and diving into the details. And having integrated frameworks that allow you to make that happen is absolutely critical, I think, in moving forward. So I'd argue in an exercise like this, just having a single index that measures something is nice, and it looks good on headline on the top of a newspaper, but unless you can do a deep dive and explain what actually feeds into that, you're not making much progress. I see that one of my colleagues has the presentation on the screen now, so that's good. So if I can move on to the next slide.
So Greg, just given the time, can you just jump ahead just because we do want to move through your
I will
presentation?
move very quickly.
Yeah.
So one of my spare time activities is as a member of the Bureau of the UN Committee of Experts on Environmental Economic Accounting. And in this committee, we've worked on developing a system of environmental economic accounts, which is essentially an environmental accounting system that is aligned with how we measure gross domestic product. As a tool, therefore, it allows us to cleanly integrate environmental phenomena with the structure of national economies. The SIA, System of Environmental Economic Accounts, is increasingly being used as an input into countries reporting into SDGs. We're looking at how to use it to monitor our post-2020 biodiversity framework, working with the IMF to determine how we can use it to better measure sustainable finance. But the key here is that it's an integrated framework that brings together environmental phenomena in economic structure. I move on to the next slide. So in order to kind of apply this, if I can ask Zia to move on to the next slide. So if I was to link together the economy and the environment, I can start with a kind of a framework that measures the economy. And in Canada, in our system of macroeconomic accounts, we've got a good characterization of the supply chain for the Canadian economy, which is characterized by what we call the supply use tables, which breaks the Canadian economy down into 236 industry groups, 496 product groups, and essentially describes what is being produced by who and what commodity output is being sold and where all of that output goes to, be it export or imports or other characteristics of final demand. By having a system of environmental economic accounts that align well with a kind of an economic accounting structure, it then allows you to do a deep dive into the structure of supply chains and take a look at the environmental impacts associated with those supply chains. So to my colleague that has control over this presentation, if you can flip straight to the second to last slide, what we can do is we can kind of rip apart the agricultural sector into kind of the industries that are growing and producing things. We can rip it apart into the commodities that are being produced and sold throughout the system. And then we can start to link to that kind of the environmental impacts associated with that. So again, if I can move to the second to last slide in that presentation, it'll show that for a range of different industries, we can start to measure the the example when we get to that slide will be of say direct and indirect GHG emissions. Because we have a kind of a structure of the supply chain for the Canadian economy, we can start to take a look at, if we were to take a look at the dairy industry, not only can we take a look at the direct GHG emissions coming from the dairy industry, but we can take a look at all of the upstream emissions that are kind of generated in order to run that dairy industry. So we're able to come up with these gross environmental flows. We produce these physical flow accounts for GHG emissions, for energy use, and for water, but the framework allows us to expand this into kind of other categories as well. I wanted to give you just that very quick example, just by way of illustrating that the key in putting together any type of indicator or index or benchmark or performance indicator, I think kind of relies on a few key things. The first one is the ability to, I'm sorry, that's the slide I'm looking for. the key in developing any kind of an index, you require, for sure, transparency in terms of methodology. You require international comparability, which is what we've been striving to do with the work that we've been doing with the UN. But the ability to integrate information either at a macro or at a macro level is absolutely essential. Otherwise, you fall into a trap of, if we think about an exercise like the ecological footprint, which is, it's a really neat product because it shows, shows an easy to digest fashion, things around sustainability. But it becomes very difficult to link the ecological footprint as a concept to other existing macro or micro measures relating to either social development or kind of the economy. So I think the key in kind of moving ahead is again the need to align to an international standard. In this particular context, I think we do need to think about what happens along entire value chains. It's hard to just compartmentalize and aggregate within individual actors in the system. And what will be key in moving ahead? There was a point made a little bit earlier about there being too much data. Never confuse data with information. Information is a derivative of data. But it's important to have at some point some sort of an integrator or means of integrating these various sources of data in order to provide a meaningful output. I'll leave it at that. I apologize for technical issues.
No, listen, not at all. Thank you very much, Greg, for your contribution. A question that comes to mind, and it was alluded to in one of the side questions in the chat space, was how are we using this data, or how is this data being used in trade discussions, in discussions around facilitating exports, how it's being used by international regulators to assess performance of a country's environmental footprint. Are you sensing that there's a shift taking place in how data is being used, or how the information from the data is being used?
You bet. Some of the users of this data include global affairs. The EU is, as they're plotting out an economic recovery, they're putting a big focus on green growth. And they're looking at frameworks like SIA in order to draw that linkage between the economy and the environment. So we can use this framework to take a look at the carbon content of Canadian exports. And our colleagues in global affairs are keenly interested in being able to describe the carbon content of Canadian exports, so as they continue to negotiate access to the European market by Canadian firms, having that type of a measure is really, really important.
Well, thank you, Greg. I think that's going to come back up, or it should come back up for discussion in our next panel. I'd like to thank our 4 panelists for panel 1 for taking a perspective on the global context. Please stick around. We might bring you back into panel 2. But right now I'd like to jump to our second discussion and introduce Deb Wilson, who's going to co-moderate our next little bit along with me. And so Deb, are you there? There you are. Deb is Chief Industry Engagement Officer for Trust BICS, Inc. And I've worked with Deb for a number of years. Delighted to have you with us. And Deb, would you like to introduce and take the ball from here for the next short while?
Well, thank you very much, David. So on this panel, we're going to be talking about enabling alignment metrics and domestic dashboards. I'd like to welcome Bronwyn Wilton, who's project lead with CASI, Canadian Agri-Food Sustainability Initiative, Michael Crow, who is with CANE, Canadian Agri-Food Automation and Intelligence Network. He's also with Lakeland College. Susie Miller, who I heard earlier today on the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef doing a presentation. She's ED of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, and Brenna Grant, who is with CanFax Research Services. And again, I heard Brenna earlier today at the CRSB AGM as well. So we're going to kick off with Bronwyn. So do you have a presentation ready, Bronwyn?
Yes, I do. And I will start my video and I will represent farmers across Canada.
Hi, Bronwyn, it's Krista
Yep.
speaking.
Yep.
We're just seeing the notes view. If you can
Oh,
change
okay.
the display settings. Yeah, great.
Here you go.
Thanks.
Thanks, Krista. Great. So the vision for the Canadian Agri-Food Sustainability Initiative is that the Canadian agri-food sector is enabled to clearly demonstrate continuous improvement towards economic, environmental, and social sustainability outcomes. And as we've heard already in this session, there's a lot going on internationally and nationally in different countries on these sustainable development goals and sustainability requests and requirements across a number of programs. So how can we develop an umbrella platform for data, programs, and tools in Canada and focus on sharing Canadian successes globally? So what we need to do is be able to link the current work happening in Canadian agriculture. And Deborah already mentioned two meetings that happened, or a meeting that happened earlier this morning on the Canadian Roundtable Sustainable Beef. And Susie will be speaking in a moment around Canadian Roundtable Sustainable Crops. So lots going on. So how can we start to link and collaborate and connect and share all our learnings and different ways of collecting data and communicating that out with international standards? And the other one is to enable Canadian producers to demonstrate their commitment to the 3 pillars of sustainability. So we know across the various commodities that are happening in the country, there's lots of things that are already being done on Canadian farms to protect water, maintain soil health, take care of animals, all those things. So how can we start to talk about those and roll them up into the metrics that will make sense through that supply chain? So what might this look like? CASSI's online platform will coordinate knowledge sharing and benchmarking for Canadian and international standards. And I'd like to mention at this point that we're very much at the beginning stages of this. The funding was announced in February of 2020. And due to COVID starting about 2 weeks later, there was a little bit of a slowdown in the project launch. So we're getting up and running this fall, and things will really start to pick up in 2021. So it's a perfect timing for a meeting like this and to share that this is happening and it has been funded by the CAP program. So CASSI, the vision is that will allow streamlining of sustainability requirements by crediting farmers for existing managing practices. And importantly, CASSI will allow for key partners to come together to create the vision that works for Canadian farmers and the agri-food value chain. So as I just mentioned, we're at the start of a 3-year funded project, and it will consist of quite a bit of research and engagement, so sector engagement to inform the CASSI platform and information sharing capabilities. So we really have a lot of plans for the fall and early winter 2021 to do research with farmers, farm organizations, value chain participants, stakeholders throughout the supply chain. And we have a governance committee that represents that supply chain as well already in place, so they'll help be shaping that research program. Research to verify and shape a platform that works for farmers, and farmers will be very much involved in that process, and farm organizations, of course, and research to inform benchmarking capacity of the platform. So lots to learn about benchmarking and what we can do in that space. So that'll be an exciting part of the project. And then, of course, ongoing knowledge sharing and communications. And I was told I had 5 minutes, so hopefully I didn't go too much over that, and but happy to join in on the questions at the appropriate time.
Okay, thanks so much, Bronwyn. Okay, next up we've got Michael Crow, and he's a board member of CANE, also working on the Sustainable Agri-Food Traceability System, and we're with Lakeland College, one of our agricultural academic institutions in Alberta. So Michael, if you would like to tee up your presentation, he's on the ball, and take it away, Michael.
Okay, thanks very much, Deb, and a huge thank you to you and to David McInnes for organizing today's webinar and the work that you are leading on the National Index on Agri-Food Performance. I think this is important work, and we're grateful to be part of the conversation today. It's a complex space, and it seems like there's more questions than answers, but I'm pleased today to share a little bit of work that's happening with Lakeland College and other partners that we're working with in the space. I want to talk about 2 initiatives that are kind of interrelated. The first, as Deb mentioned, is CANE. So CANE is the Canadian Agri-Food Automation and Intelligence Network. And in July of last year, of 2019, Kane announced that it had successfully applied for $49.5 million in funding from Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. Whoops. Sorry about that. So we're hoping to match that funding with some industry dollars and have a project footprint of about $108 million. And the focus of the projects within Kane are this intersection between technology and agri-food and ag production. The initiative is being led by Alberta Innovates, and there are 8 kind of core partners that came together and collaborated on the proposal and that are helping to lead some of the project work in these 4 core project areas. So smart farming, automation and robotics, data integration and analytics. And then this 4th one, sustainability, traceability, and producer premiums. And I'd like to kind of focus on this 4th box here for the next few minutes. So a couple of those core partners, including Lakeland College and Trust Bix, Varesco Solutions is an important partner on this, as is Farm Lead. We're developing what we're calling a sustainable agri-food traceability platform. This is covering some ground that's been covered today, but I think we're all probably well aware of some of the trends that are happening globally, where we see large corporate retailers setting aggressive value chain targets relating to sustainability metrics and sustainability goals. And I think this global movement is really presenting a major opportunity for the Canadian agri-food sector. And I think, that's kind of what's uniting us here today. The contribution we'd like to make to that important work is the development of a sustainability platform. And, I think Bronwyn and I need to chat because, I think we're working along some similar themes here. But one of the things that we're hoping to achieve here is to be able to develop a platform that will measure and track the sustainability attributes of food throughout the entire value chain using blockchain technology. The goal here, and I know there's a lot going on this slide, but if we kind of focus on the center box, this is the platform that's hoping to provide that chain of custody. We want to utilize information, data that already exists in smart farm technologies that are being used by producers. And we'd like to integrate sustainability metric calculators like the Cool Farm tool or the Field to Market calculator. And our goal here is to quantify and certify the sustainable production practices that exist across the entire value chain, all the way from producers to the major retailers, and ultimately to have information available to consumers. Some of the outputs that we're hoping to see through the creation of this platform include data dashboards that shows sustainability metrics and sustainability performance against KPIs, economic performance and economic KPIs, traceability and food safety, and then the ability for peer-to-peer benchmarking within the value chain as it relates to sustainable practice and sustainable performance. So it just maybe to go back to a question David posed earlier in terms of, will we be believed here in Canada? There's only one person I believe at face value, and that's my mother. Everybody else has to show me the data. And that's what we're trying to do here, right, is collect the data that's needed to verify and validate that sustainable practices and quantify that sustainable practices that exist throughout the value chain. So I kind of touched on most of this. Maybe I'll just focus on this idea of monetizing sustainability because I think it's really important. I think it's critical that we monetize some of this work if we're going to solicit buy-in from the value chain participants, including from producers. I think that monetization could come in a number of different forms, whether it's premiums that are made available to value chain participants like producers, or whether it's expanding market access, or access to premium markets, or whether the data that we're generating through this process can inform producers and other value chain participants in lowering costs and creating efficiencies. But I think that's an important component of what we're trying to achieve here. We've got between 30 and 40 partners that are working with us on this initiative, and we're certainly interested in working with others. So, if anybody on the call today is interested in learning more about the work that's happening here, we'd love to hear from you. Yeah.
With that, Michael, I'm just going to pose a question to you and Bronwyn. So what's really driving these initiatives? What's driving this change? Is it the consumers? Is it the shareholders in the companies? Is it the producers themselves? And then one more question on top of that, who's driving it and who's going to pay for it?
Yeah, well, I think, actually, Bronwyn, I'm sorry. You please feel free to jump in. Yeah.
Yep, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I would say there's multiple drivers here. Certainly claims that large corporations are making with respect to sustainability goals is certainly one of the major drivers. I think shareholders are holding corporations accountable in that regard, and we're seeing increasing examples of annual reports including information about sustainability, right? Not just economic metrics. We're also, I think pressure from consumers is also a major driver. And some of these consumers are in domestic markets and some of them are in international markets. But those are the major drivers or some of them anyways, that we're observing.
And
there's probably others.
Yeah, Bronwyn, have you got any other comments?
No, I would add that I would just echo Michael's comments there. It seems to be coming from that corporate responsibility piece and whatever shape that's taking, and that's probably largely driven by the consumers at the product end. But yeah, I think your question about who will pay is a tricky one. It's difficult to handle that one. Farmers are generally price takers and difficult for them to drive the price of the product. So I think that one is challenging, but it may become where there's a market access risk if farmers aren't able to participate in any of these sustainability indices and things like that. So I think that's where there could be that risk of being left out of premium markets or things like that if there is a problem with being able to show evidence and data of the practices at the farm level.
So I may have cut you a little short, Michael, but we're running short on time. And do you just want to quickly touch on this slide? Then I'm going to ask sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Deb. I'll wrap up right away here. Just maybe I'll use this last slide or two just to answer your question about who's going to pay.
Okay.
And I just want to talk about the Canadian Beef Sustainability Acceleration Pilot really briefly. The key partners that were involved in this are listed there. Cargill, Trustbix, and retail partners of Cargill have really been driving a lot of this, including McDonald's and other important partners. The Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef has played a critical role in all of this work. I mean, just at a really high level, this pilot project showed where it kind of answered your question, Deb, about who can pay for some of this. And what we saw in this pilot project was these major retailers setting aside some of the profits that they're generating by selling sustainable food products. Those profits have been put into a pool, and the funding in that pool has been redistributed back through the value chain to any participant that was part of producing that sustainable food in the first place. And so this is a great example of where producer premiums can help pay for some of these practices. Here's some data on what those premiums looked like on a per head basis on this particular pilot. It was an exciting day at Lakeland College when cattle from our ranch made its way through this pilot, and the students that were in charge of that project received a check, a rebate or a premium check for for being participants in the certified, audited, sustainable process.
Okay.
That pilot's a permanent program. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Deb.
Okay. Thanks. We're running short of time, and I don't want anybody to be missed. So thanks so much, Michael. If we could get Susie Miller up and with her presentation. And Susie's going to give us the lowdown on the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. So thanks, Susie, for being right there and on the ball.
Okay. Good afternoon. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk much about what the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops is, but get into a discussion about how we have used metrics and why. The first thing is that market requirements drove what we did in terms of the metrics. So the grains industry generally isn't required to have individual certification and traceability in the same way that the beef industry does, partly because the grains are mixed, but it isn't as a universal market requirement. However, the need for marketers to identify and respond to sustainability questions and concerns. So what we determined was that the best approach to take, at least initially, was to identify and develop fact-based information on the sustainability of Canadian grain production. And we wanted to do it in such a way as that it responded to market requirements. This is our Canadian Grain Sustainability Metrics Platform, published in 2018, recently updated and made bilingual. I'm not going to tell you how many metrics we have because I don't know. I know we have 133 different graphs, but there's all sorts of other data as well. So this is what we selected. First of all, to echo something that Chris said earlier, information at the production level is much more extensive than information at the processing, transportation, etc. So we focused on the production level. What we did, because this was based on the markets, we looked at and selected the 5 top sustainability standards, benchmarking systems that are being used on the grain side. There are some issues with those, and I'll talk more about them later, but essentially we decided that that was the most, that provided the most relevant indicator of the metrics that would be required. So we ended up with 12 sustainability reports. 7 of them are on environment, the first 7 across the top. We've got 1 on financial viability, and we've got 4 on the social aspects of it. Really a lot of it's focusing around labor, and that has to do with why some of these sustainability standards were developed in the first place. Unilever, for example, it was an issue of palm oil. The Roundtable for Sustainable Soy, it was production of soy in South America. So a lot of them was plantation agriculture, corporate agriculture, rather than family-owned farms. So we actually have 2 on labor, and we have 1 on integration in the community. And even the work safety and security is focused a lot on workers. We use 3 types of data. Because it's permitted internationally in these schemes, we use legal and program infrastructure. We used aggregate outcomes, and we used aggregated practices. So we said, okay, this many producers use these many practices. So what I wanted to do is to give you the benefit of some of our experience in the selection, the methodology, and the source. Some of this will be repeats, particularly from what Victoria and Chris said earlier. In terms of the selection, absolutely fit to purpose. And I believe this is something Victoria said. What matters? The metric has to be known to the audience. It has to resonate with them. It has to describe something that they care about. And if it's not known, then it has to be intuitive. Has to be measured. Not everything can be measured. We think it can, but some is much more challenging. Scope. What part of the supply chain and what products? Not only did we focus on producers because we had that information available, but the other thing is that companies weren't interested in disclosing their information.
So,
And then
Susie-
geography. So
Susie, I just want to give you 1 minute notice, okay?
Sure.
Just so we can stay on schedule. Thank you.
no problem. Are we going for Canada, subnational, major production areas? The methodology, definitely there's so many. And is there an existing standards, and is it relevant to Canada? For example, a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions use carbon sequestration or soil organic carbon change. For us, that's really critical in terms of our measurement. Is there an alternative? What time frame, absolute or relative? And then it comes to source. International sources, talked about that earlier. Governments is the most credible source, but the unpublished data is often the most valuable, not the published data. And it takes time. And if you want unpublished data, cost is an issue. Industry, there are credibility cautions, but that can be overcome. It's expensive, but it's flexible. So these are the types of learnings we have had. Would we do it again differently? Probably not. Is it suitable for a succinct report? Not in the same way as I think we're looking for in a national index. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Susie. And awesome for wrapping up like that. So now we have Brenna Grant. Brenna was presenting this morning to the CRSB. So she works with Canfax Research Services. So she's the girl in the beef industry that loves numbers and explains them all to us regularly. So Brenna, I'm going to let you take it away. Thank you.
Can you guys see my screen?
We can.
What are you seeing though?
We are, yeah, we're not seeing your slideshow. We're seeing your actual presentation with the other slides.
Well, unfortunately, it's not letting me actually do anything once I get in here. Just a second, let me stop sharing.
If you don't mind us seeing your notes.
Well, let me see if I can actually do this a different way.
Hey.
Is that working?
We're still seeing, we're not seeing your slideshow.
Okay, so this is it. Somehow we're locked up here. So I'm hoping that it's big enough that you guys can see it.
No, I think we're okay.
Alrighty. Well, I am Brenna Grant with Canfax Research Services, and we provide staff support for the Scientific Advisory Committee for the Canadian Roundtable of Sustainable Beef. And CRSB has a mission to advance continuous improvement of the Canadian beef industry sustainability through multi-stakeholder engagement, collaboration, communication, and science. And that's really done through the membership. And there are currently over 100 members that are a part of this, really driving it forward. But the Global Roundtable developed 5 principles that are really guiding how everything is built on this conversation. And this really helps us avoid that cherry picking that Chris mentioned earlier, of making sure that we have items under each of these buckets, because we want to be working on all of these fronts. We don't know where the next conversational piece is going to come from. But this also helps us from avoiding going to where we have a lot of data in the industry. So the first piece that I want to talk about in terms of the 3 areas of work for CRSB is our sustainability benchmarking. This is done through the National Beef Sustainability Assessment, which provides a comprehensive benchmark covering environment, land use, the social as well as economic indicators. And some of our environmental indicators, such as greenhouse gas emissions and blue water footprint, are some of the lowest in the world and well below the global average. But the biggest point is we don't just stop at benchmarking. We built a sustainability strategy with 10 goals in order to focus on how are we going to advance each of these areas. And under each of these 10 goals, we have action items attached to it. But recognizing that we need to focus on, keeping the momentum in this conversation. At the halfway point back in January, we published an interim report, and we were really pleased to see the progress that we had made in these areas, but it also identified where we need to focus and provides direction for the next 3 years moving forward. The other area is the sustainability framework, which provides certified sustainable beef, and it has certifications, sourcing, and assurances. And this is one of the tools that we're using in order to advance sustainability within the beef industry. And this allows retail and food service to source a certified product that meets the CRSB standards. Another area that we're able to actually provide momentum for the conversation is with our sustainability projects pillar. This encourages members to align with the sustainability strategy, connect and collaborate with others working in similar areas, and then communicate their results back through an annual survey. And we also provide letters of support for funding proposals, but this allows for really clear communication and transparency of the efforts that are happening within the industry. So just wanting to wrap up, when I think about how we can move from a commodity specific item going national, we have a lot of data at the commodity level, and we can be very specific to producers. But when I think nationally, you really have to go back to that question of what do you want to measure, and what is it that you really want to move the needle on in this conversation? You need to then measure it, set goals to advance it, and then create systems for continuous improvement that encourage alignment with those goals, and always have that feedback reporting back loop in order to actually communicate what success is and how these numbers are being used. Because the response burden issue is very real for producers. They have a limited time, and we want them to go outside doing the good things that they are to feed the world. But we also need to be careful of what we're asking them to be reporting more numbers on.
So with that, I have some questions for Susie and for Brenna. And Brenna, of course, you sit at many of the committee meetings and some of the boardroom tables I do. And as coming from a producer background, I always joke around and say I have trouble deciding if I'm there with my corporate hat or my producer hat on. They spin depending on what's being brought to the table. So I want to talk to both you and Susie about a global frame of reference to develop Canadian benchmarks. Do we develop them nationally using global guidelines, or do we simply adopt a global benchmark? And there was some chat about, are these programs pre-competitive, or maybe you could comment on one. We'll start with Brenna and then we'll go to Susie if you don't mind. And we'll start with the frame of reference and benchmarks.
Absolutely. And I would say that what we've done in the beef industry is both a top-down and a bottom-up approach, which means we talked very closely with the Global Roundtable of Sustainable Beef. We adopted their definition, their principles in terms of what we wanted to cover to ensure that we had alignment globally. But then we took the bottom-up approach and asked, what do we already have existing in Canada? What is the data that we have available from existing sources in order to build this? And we did both of those things when we built the first National Beef Sustainability Assessment. And I think that's really important in terms of the give and take of recognizing and being able to capitalize on what you have in a specific country, but also providing enough high-level alignment that you still have those connections.
Yeah,
and I can't remember what your second question was.
Well, we'll go to Susie now.
Okay.
And I just want to, before Susie starts, I want to comment to everybody on the call that we do have some European people on the call. And I want to comment that we have a very, very diverse geography in Canada. So it was very challenging, and it continues to be challenging for both of our roundtables to develop indicators for sustainability. So with that, Susie, I'm going to let you take it away.
She's muted.
Oh, we can't hear you, Susie. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Apologize.
No worries.
There's two ways of looking at it. There's a pull or a push. And the pull is something that we in the grains industry haven't experienced as much as the animal industry, for example. But we know we can't ignore where the pull is coming from, whether it's the UN Sustainable Goals or whatever. The push, which is what informed our metrics platform and which informed Brenna's bottom-up approach on the beef sustainability assessment, is what matters. Where are we? Where can we make the best case of within what matters of where we're at? Where can we best tell our story? So I think it's a balance between the two. Ignore either of them, and we end up with a product that isn't particularly useful to either promotion or to response.
I have one other question. Are these programs that have been developed, are they outcome-based or are they prescriptive? How are we viewing them?
So on the beef side, everything is outcome-based. That's one of the main tenets of the Certified Sustainable Beef Framework. But even in our goal setting, it is very much outcome-based in terms of what we want to achieve, allowing each of the regions within Canada and each of the production systems to figure out how they are going to get there.
I would say it's a combination. I mean, we try to be outcome-based, but the international standards for the grains industry tends to be practice-based. So the outcomes don't resonate in the same way. It's not as equivalent. So we hedge our bets in terms of data that we provide so we can respond to everything. But the preference definitely is outcome-based.
So,
Deb, could I just jump very quickly?
Yes.
I've been following with interest the discussion with the four panelists, and I want to just signal to my colleague at GIFS, Funke, about the poll questions. Because we're going to be putting up 2 questions for everyone very shortly. And Funke, let me know when you're ready. But I do have a question for all 4 of our speakers. And Deb, maybe you could just navigate this question a little bit. But really, what we're seeing is within Canada a whole range of fabulous initiatives to respond to this changing marketplace. And then we're seeing globally this tremendous number of initiatives to respond to a sustainably stressed world. So can we as a country get aligned across this diverse landscape with many different geographies, as Deb mentioned, but also different sectors, export and domestic? Is it possible for us to develop a national index? Is that within reach, do you think? I'm thinking for their 4 speakers particularly.
So Michael, if you want to come back, and I know that is a goal of CASI. I know also that is a goal of SAF. And I know that there is already collaboration happening between the Roundtable for Sustainable Crops and the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. So I don't know if any of these particular groups, but maybe Michael and Bronwyn could weigh in on this, and we'll maybe start out with Bronwyn, please.
Sure. I think it's a great question, and I do think Canada is definitely diverse, and the commodities and the farm practices across the country are incredibly different. And so I think that's one of the important things with CASI, as we've had discussions over the years leading up to this current funding, is that the idea that you can bring all the commodities into some type of a program umbrella platform at least, and looking at that from an outcomes perspective. So no matter where you are in Canada, water quality is important, soil health is important, animal care, greenhouse gas emissions. So there are these cross-cutting kind of topics and issues that are important for no matter what sector you're in and no matter what part of the country. So if you're looking at it from a environmental and economic and social practices within those 3 pillars of sustainability, looking at those in terms of what everyone could be striving towards. And I think that's important no matter what. For some industries, for horticulture is quite labor intensive, for example. So we haven't talked a lot about labor this afternoon, but there is the health and safety and employee rights and those types of things. So what's good for the horticulture sector is also, as other commodities might add staffing in that, that's important as well. And that might be something that corporate environmental and social governance pieces are looking for. So I think some of those pieces, if we look at from those 3 pillars of sustainability, then absolutely it's a good goal to be working towards. And I'll turn it over to Michael.
Okay, Michael, maybe you could talk about how SAF is developing to try to meet these requirements.
Yeah, sure. Well, similar to what Bronwyn talked about, I mean, we're working very closely with the round tables and in using some of the standards that they've established, the codes of practice that they've established, with the goal of achieving kind of a national, an index that's national in scope and that accounts for the variation in geography and the diversity in commodities and those kinds of things. I think Bronwyn was right on the mark. There's a lot of cross-cutting metrics that are important to all sectors, and I think we're making. I think nationally we're making good progress towards having a national index that captures that footprint, and certainly the roundtables both play a critical role. I think the key to being successful though is collaboration and making sure that we're all kind of uniting our efforts in measuring and tracking the data that's relevant to that index, and I think that's starting to happen as well. So I'm optimistic, David, that we will get there.
Brenna, I just wonder if Brenna wanted to make one comment about, I know Bronwyn brought up the topic of employees, how you handle your employees and the workers on the farms. And Brenna, I think that's addressed to some degree. I know from my work with the CRSB, that is addressed to some degree. Can you confirm that I'm correct on that? Is that part of the framework?
Yeah, people in the community is one of the 5 principles that everything is based on. And the other thing that CRSB always talks about is the fact that the expectation that companies and producers are all working within the legal structures provided here in Canada. And so there are a lot of things that are provided both federally and provincially.
And Susie, can you comment on that from a crops perspective?
Yeah,
has that been something you've talked about?
Yes, on the metrics platform, for example, we do have a lot of labor components. We've got the force social, but we're also currently developing a code of practice. And in the code of practice, we do have a health and wellness that, even though the grains industry probably of all of them have the least hired labor and more family labor, it's still important. People are still important, whether they own the farm or whether they work on the farm.
Thanks, Susie, and thank you, Deb, and everybody. I'm wondering if I could just segue into our poll questions because we're wrapping up our time together.
Yeah.
Funke, could you post those and take over the mic? Because I think you've got a couple of instructions for everybody.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I'm sorry, there is some problem with my system buffering right now.
Okay.
So if you can just give me a minute.
You just jump in when it's ready because we want to get these posted. So you just do what you have to do.
Okay.
I'm wondering if from the yes.
I was wondering if I could make one more comment. It's Bronwyn.
Absolutely, yes.
I was just, I wanted to mention too that there is so much diversity in the Canadian agriculture commodities sector that the two roundtables are really important. There's also a Dairy Pro Action program that's been doing a lot of really important work. And then a lot of commodities too are slightly smaller in nature. So we have an important in Ontario dairy goat sector and sheep, and then we have some of the horticulture products are slightly smaller. And I think whatever we do work together towards should make sure we include those ones that might not have as much organizational or financial capacity to participate in some of these programs or develop their own. So that's one of the important parts of CASI, is to make sure we are inclusive of smaller, more regional in northern Canada, those types of agricultural activities that might be happening outside the big commodity groups that we see very active in the space currently. So that's something to keep in mind for all of us, I think.
Well, thanks very much. And that's why we wanted to bring a diversity of folks together today in order to sort of get that advice and guidance. And for our friends who were in panel 1, you can see this discussion really is focused on the nuts and bolts of how does a country respond to. Useful for you to see how even a so-called advanced economy, or a middle economy, as Victoria put it earlier, even despite all of our good governance practices and good regulatory practices and so forth, we're trying to work through all this, and it's not necessarily easy. Chris, do you want to have a quick comment, and then we're going to do our poll because we are wrapping up. But Chris, please make your thoughts known to us.
Yeah, very shortly. Just to draw maybe a caution, a word of caution. I think we need to also avoid falling into the measurement for measurement. I think one of the exclusion criteria you need to have across your metrics would be, one, any indicators that can be measured is fine, but as long as, or unless you can actually tell by going up or down, that indicators is improving the sustainability in one of the dimensions, it should not be included. This is not measuring toward one dimension of sustainability. And again, one of the exclusion criteria should be, if you're not clear about whether you improve or not your system, you should not include it in.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very helpful piece of advice. Okay, Funke, could you please post the polls, and then let's get people's reactions to these two things, please.
Sure. Okay, so hi everyone. I tried to make my video visible, but my system started to buffer. There are 2 questions, and we have a minute to complete the poll. So I'm going to open the poll now. You can expand the view of the poll on your screen by drawing if you look at the dividing line between the chat area and the rest of the screen, you can draw that further, like a table, to expand your view. So I'm going to open the poll now, and we've got a minute to complete it. Thanks. And the poll is now open.
Thank you, Funky, for doing that. I'm wondering if we need a full minute for this, but let's just give it a little bit of time. So for those who are undecided, clock is ticking.
Yes, we do have a full minute for this.
We do. Okay.
And it's almost off.
Okay. And are you able to tabulate the results quite quickly?
Yes, you should see the results pop up on your screen pretty soon. It's just waiting for the last responses and counting down.
So I thought the last discussion that we were having that brought the social factor into this and moving beyond environmental is really quite consistent with this first question. And so just looking at the results, it seems that we are, as a country, largely focused at how we are reporting social, environmental, health, safety factors. We're minimally or somewhat, although some believe that we are doing so generally. So it seems like for the most part, we're in the middle of the pack, thinking there's room for improvement, perhaps. And then the bottom question is, how important is this to validate whatever this national set of indicators is against relevant, credible global practices? And I think there's no surprise here that many of the results are at the high end. That being said, if there's anybody who has some suggestions or believe that there are some indicators or metrics out there or practices that we should be inspired by or look into, please note that in the chat box or email me after this webinar, because we do want to get people's views as best as we can. Any comments on these results? We really only have a couple of minutes left. Does anyone have a striking reaction to what they've seen? Okay, well, I think this will be helpful to us, the partners, the 21 partners who have made this national index discussion possible. We'll be going through the findings, the comments, the survey questions. They're not scientific, but they provide a finger in the wind, if you will, as to what people might be thinking. I should just add that our process continues. We are going to have, I believe at this point, another stakeholder webinar on November the 18th. We're looking at focusing on the policy and regulatory and strategic implications of the national index and its development. A number of comments were made there today, including, as Greg pointed out at the very earlier part, around what this means for our trade relations and market access. There are other aspects to this, so we're going to be working our way through what might be an effective webinar to look at the policy considerations. We are going to be wrapping up our work very soon in terms of framing this to take forward. And so your feedback after this call can be treated confidentially by myself. So I'd appreciate any feedback or ideas. I want to thank all our speakers and Deb, our moderator for panel 2. You really did bring a diversity of perspective, but wow, there was a lot of alignment from what people were saying and a lot of good guidance. So thank you deeply for taking time from around the world and from across this country to talk to us today. And I would like to also thank GIFS, Funke and Tina for enabling this webinar. Really, it was wonderful to work with you. More to come, I hope, but I really do appreciate that. PowerPoints, speakers, please send them to me. I'd like to post them on the website next week with the recording of this webinar. So we'll set that up and we'll be on the GIFS platform, and that will be sent as a link to all of you. I hope I haven't missed anything, but thank you very much for your time. And so this brings an end to our webinar 2 minutes ahead of schedule. So hope you all enjoy your evening and your day, and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Well done. Well done, David and Deborah.
Thank you.